Club of Ann Arbor for this wonderful award. It's very touching and meaningful for me. I'd like to thank the members of my club who have come at your invitation to share in this moment, and of course greet the past district governors and Jane, who's about to become a new district governor. We're celebrating, as was mentioned earlier, a number of momentous times in history, last year and this year. Last year, the 100th anniversary of your Rotary Club. Last year, the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor and the beginning of World War II. This year, we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of women being admitted to Rotary. And that was a big thing then. And as we look back on that 30 years, it turns out it was a wonderful thing for Rotary, we hope. Really excellent histories written about the founding of Rotary. As you know, it started in 1905 in Chicago. A couple of guys, basically from Chicago, feeling lonesome, wanted to get together. From all the histories that I have ever read, there's never been any indication that they considered women in their group whatsoever. Not at all. But that's not surprising when you think about it. In those times, women were not professional people. They did not have a chance to go to law school, medical school, except for one women's medical college. They were not admitted to practice law, even though they studied in a law office. Women had the following jobs most of the time: school teachers, librarians, nurses, secretary, or all too frequently cleaning other people's houses. It's also not surprising that Paul Harris and his friends didn't consider women, because we mustn't forget what was going on in Chicago at that time. In Chicago at that time, the first women's rights movement was getting geared up for their big push to get the vote. That was going to require a constitutional amendment. It all happened and went into effect in 1920. By 1905, they were just getting started. Another group of active women was going on in Chicago as well, and this was the Women's Christian Temperance movement, who were gearing up for a constitutional amendment also, which we now call prohibition. I have a feeling that the original Rotarians didn't really want to have a lot to do with either of those groups. Now, very soon after the first Rotary Club started in Chicago, there was a great earthquake and fire in San Francisco, and a number of people from Chicago went out to help rebuild San Francisco. And a couple of them started a Rotary Club in San Francisco. That club quickly started another club in Oakland, and so it went. And soon there were Rotary clubs all around America, and eventually Rotary expanded internationally with the first international club in Winnipeg, Manitoba. But Rotary went on very quickly to England and Ireland, and then ultimately to the various countries that made up what we now call the British Commonwealth. There were never any discussions about women joining that group. But one of the things that did happen was that women were very interested in the work of Rotary, and particularly the wives of Rotarians. And finally, in Manchester, England in 1924, a group of wives got together and formed an official organization that they called the Inner Wheel. A similar organization here in the United States called the Rotary Anns more or less got going. But the Inner Wheel developed a whole entire organization totally parallel to Rotary. And they took on all kinds of volunteer activities similar to their husbands' Rotary clubs. And Inner Wheel spread very quickly as well to Britain, Scotland, finally over to Scandinavia, and down into what we now call British Commonwealth countries. Then, of course, came the day that President Roosevelt said, "We'll live in infamy." Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. I was growing up in Southern California at the time, and I was in 7th grade, so I remember that very, very clearly. There was only a few hours time change between Hawaii and Southern California, and we were getting live reports on shortwave radio, contemporaneous with what was going on. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan, And the following day, Germany declared war on the United States. And so World War II began, and the U.S. was changed forever. The entire country went on a wartime footing. Unlike today, when we can be at war someplace and you don't even seem to know it when you're living your life here, just a normal life. But not then. In 1941, the entire country went on a wartime footing. Out there at Willow Run, where they used to make cars, they were now making fighter airplanes. At Hamtramck, where they used to make cars, they were now making big tanks. All the Chrysler plants were making the Jeeps that carry the guys around North Africa and over the passes in Italy. There were shortages of everything, and there were great, there was a gasoline, for example. It was all rationed. You could get very little gasoline. There was rationing of food, much food, shoes. Every shoe manufacturer started making boots for the soldiers. The only civilian shoes they made were for little kids who grew too fast to wait for the war to be over. The kids, another thing that happened, our family had a gardener. He was Japanese American. He was taken and interned on the high desert at Myanmar. I'll never forget the internment of Japanese because I witnessed it happening all over Los Angeles, piled into trucks, one suitcase only. The mortgages on their farms foreclosed. My mother did everything she could with the ladies in our church to help provide them with what they needed. But it was a sad time for our country. Anyway, the kids couldn't even have a sport team because you couldn't drive anywhere to have a competition. Almost nothing was available in terms of children doing things outside of school. And so we just stayed home. Don't forget there were no official airlines, commercial airlines at the time. All the airplanes that were flying anywhere were government airplanes, and all the trains were taken over for troop transport and the transportation of supplies to the different docks. And so we just stayed home and we worked very hard. And as was explained, I made up my mind right then and there that when I grew up, I would do something to make sure this never happened again. I would find a way. And so I worked very hard, and then you heard, after I graduated, I went to Stanford, and then I got into Stanford Law School. And that was the beginning of my post-war life. The post-war was an amazing era. We think of all the new developments in science and technology. Many of those developments actually began during the war, like the atomic energy research, which led to the atomic and nuclear age. My husband worked at a lab at Harvard where they developed blood plasma. The lab was under lock and key with an armed guard all during the war. But that was just the beginning of the fantastic medical research that came along right after the war. There were some German scientists and engineers who developed this jet-propelled buzz bomb that was the bane of London. As the war was ending, Bernhard von Braun and the other engineers and scientists secretly made their way down through Germany, through the British-occupied territory, and by prearrangement hid out in the mountains of Austria until the American occupation forces arrived. Then they came and surrendered and were quickly whisked back to America, where they began the jet age and ultimately the space age for America. It was a time of great advancement. But the most dramatic changes produced by the war were not in science and technology, but in the attitudes of the survivors. The people who had gone to war, who had given their all, were determined that we would never go back to the way things were before the war. All during that war, do you realize the armed forces were segregated? You had black service units with white commanders. You had the Tuskegee Airmen. But immediately after the war, President Truman desegregated all the armed forces, including the service academies, assuring that we would finally have minority officers and fully integrated troops. And so after the war began this march toward our civil rights in this country. People were never going to go back again. And in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, we pressed ahead. The survivors pressed ahead. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was finally adopted, and it prohibited discrimination in employment, in private employment. And that was the beginning of the opening crack for women. Until then, women had no rights whatsoever to any kind of work. In fact, when the war was over, many of them had been laid off from the jobs that they had been working on during the war effort. There was veterans' preference, of course, as well. So the discrimination against women was continuing until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then, of course, the big civil rights movement that everybody supported for minorities. And finally, as was pointed out, in 1974, Congress passed Title IX, which eliminated discrimination in education. And that also included educational employment, because until that time, the Civil Rights Act had not applied to public employment. But with the Title IX, then finally public employment, particularly in the schools, was ultimately covered. And so you see, these were the things that were happening at that time. The country was marching toward a pattern of equality, finally. And I can tell you that this struggle was immensely important. For example, the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education finally gave up on this concept of separate but equal is okay. Finally. And the Congress also upheld the laws that Congress had passed. The Supreme Court upheld the laws that Congress had passed. So anyway, there soon began this parade that Elaine mentioned, the parade of the first woman two. We had Sandy O'Connor named to the Supreme Court. We had Sally Ride, the first woman in space. Suddenly, before we knew it here in Ann Arbor, there was a woman president of Princeton, then of Harvard, then of MSU. And another thing that was happening at that time was that the banking laws were revised so that married women could get credit without their husbands having to co-sign on the debt. This had been something that had prohibited women from going into small business. Who would want to go into a risky small business and jeopardize their husband's income and pension and their home? It just wasn't happening. But these laws were all starting to change, and all I can say is that the women were taking advantage of those opportunities and those legal rights immediately. They were on the march, they were doing it, and they were getting in there and they were taking advantage of their rights. But I have to tell you, as those women moved up the ladder, they noticed something about Rotary. How could they not notice Rotary? Half of their colleagues were going off to the Rotary meeting once a week. Of course the women were watching Rotary. And they were noticing that Rotary had come through the World War II in a very dramatic fashion. Rotary's newly well-funded foundation was freshly recommitted to world peace and understanding. There were all kinds of new humanitarian programs available with the assistance of Rotary International. Women noticed that Rotary had always had men of color and men from a great variety of national backgrounds. There had never in Rotary been discrimination on any basis like that against men at all. Women noticed that. But of course they also noticed there weren't any women in Rotary yet. But the move was so strong in the United States that the Rotary Board of Directors, there in Evanston, Illinois, started taking straw polls. I don't know whether any of you remember who were involved in a straw poll, but there were straw polls taken to see what people thought about women in Rotary. And in the United States, it was overwhelmingly popular. Of course, people wanted to have women in Rotary. And many clubs, maybe big inner city clubs particularly, were having trouble keeping up their membership. And they knew that if they could be recruiting professional women, it would help tremendously. But there were many clubs all around the world who had both cultural and, frankly, religious objections. Well, of course, the end was in sight, the lawsuit. Why is it whenever anybody wants to bring a lawsuit that changes social mores completely, They always go to California, but they didn't. All right, so they went to California. It was a small little Rotary club out in Duarte, California. And they admitted 3 women all at once because, you know, we all know admitting 1 woman just makes them too much of a standout, 3 women together. And they took care to let Rotary International know that they had done this. And so eventually it went up the ladder in Rotary, and the Rotary Board became aware of what had happened. And the Rotary Board gave them the ultimatum: you can't have women, it violates our Constitution, and you must release them. And the Rotary Club of Duarte properly said no. So the Rotary Board of Directors canceled their charter, lifted their charter. And so the Rotary Club of Duarte sued the Rotary International. Now they were relying upon a California statute. It says, let me read it exactly to you. The law entitles all persons, regardless of sex, to full and equal accommodation, advantages, facilities, privileges, and services in all business establishments in the state. The lower California court ruled that Rotary Club of Duarte was not a business establishment, and so the law did not apply. And the Rotary Club of Duarte appealed. The California Court of Appeals, interpreting the California law, said no, what it really means is people in business, not businesses, not incorporated businesses, but people in business. And so they said that the law does apply to the Rotary Club. And then they cited very extensive documentation about how important being a Rotarian can be for a person's business, and how it was so good to be a Rotarian that many businesses paid the dues of their employees who were Rotarians. And then they cited all the materials that Rotary International develops, including training programs of all sorts for the local Rotarians, and said, this, folks, this is a business activity, and women cannot be excluded. So you need to know that Rotary International appealed to the Supreme Court and made a very, very vigorous case for themselves. They argued, first of all, of course, that the interpretation of California law was wrong, but the Supreme Court said, when we're dealing with a state law, we look to the highest appellate court in the state to help us decide what that law means. That court has spoken, we accept their interpretation of what that law means. So Rotary argued that that law, as applied to a Rotary club, was a violation of the club members' freedom of association. A constitutional right, which is how it got to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said several interesting things. First of all, that there are 2 different sorts of associational rights that the Constitution acknowledges. The first is intimate associational rights, usually belonging to family members, spouses, closely held friendships. That is an association that is not marked by opening up to the public, or by receiving new people on a regular basis, or by movement in and out. And the data showed that there were about 10% of Rotarians a year leave Rotary, one reason or another. And so there's continuous movement in and out, and that does not apply to an intimate relationship. But there is another kind of relationship also protected, and that's what's called just kind of expressive relations. And that's where Rotary came in, of course. It would also apply to members of a church, a sports club probably, or people who are gathered together for some expressive purpose. And they don't mind, others come to their meetings. They encourage people and recruit new people all the time. And the court pointed out at that point, Rotary has a tradition of accepting total strangers into their midst, which is true. This is an opportunity to do makeups anywhere in the world. That's how it works with us. And so the Supreme Court held that there was a violation of Rotarians' associational rights. What the court went on to say it's okay for a state to restrict those rights in some circumstances. Not for trivial reasons. But if there's a compelling state reason why associational rights need to be restricted, the court will accept that. And they said that California has strenuously argued it is the purpose of this law to protect women in business and the professions from discrimination. And that is a compelling state interest and justifies the removal of associational rights from male Rotarians. So the Supreme Court upheld the lower appellate court decision and ruled against Rotary International. It was a unanimous decision with 2 justices not considering it, including Sandy O'Connor, who I guess was probably married to a Rotarian. The one thing you need to know, and then I'm going to close, the most significant thing about this case is the people who filed amicus briefs. All right. On behalf of the Rotary International, an amicus brief was filed by the Boy Scouts of America. On behalf of the Rotary Club of Duarte, the state of California was allowed to officially intervene because it was their law under attack. And the California Attorney General argued the case before the court along with representatives of the Rotary clubs. But in addition, there were 10 other state attorney generals who filed amicus briefs against Rotary International, favoring the admission of women to Rotary. 10 attorneys general, including the Attorney General of the state of Illinois, where Rotary International is incorporated. I must say, also Kiwanis and Lions Club joined the case against Rotary. So I think the handwriting was on the wall. And so the Rotary Board of Directors ruled that the requirement of men only was absolutely suspended and lifted for any club in which it was against the law, and let the clubs decide whether it was against the law or not. And then the Board of Directors took the matter to the Council on Legislation, where with much twisting of arms, they finally accepted it. So anyway, that all happened in 1987, and that's when I joined Rotary. When I joined Rotary, I was the highest ranking woman at the University of Ann Arbor, except for the Dean of the School of Nursing. And frankly, I have to say, I have really enjoyed being a Rotarian. I hope the rest of you agree. It's a wonderful organization to belong to. Frankly, it has changed my life and offered me tremendous opportunities to meet and work with people from all over the world whom I never would have met before. I've had a chance to do so many different things because Rotary is a very flexible organization. It gives members a chance to follow their passion and to do so many different things, so many different areas of service. If you have an idea and you're willing to work for that idea, there is almost certainly going to be somebody in Rotary who will work with you, and Rotary will accommodate you. That's what's so great about Rotary. And so I want you to know that the Supreme Court felt it was going to help Rotary a lot if they would admit women. Didn't think there was much of a burden on the Rotary at all by requiring them to admit women. And I hope you feel the same way too, that it has helped Rotary a lot. Thank you again so much.